Can. So first, I just want to introduce the team a little bit more. So I'm Dan Kanji. I'm the Vice President of Client Accounting Services at Support Kansas City. I'm joined by Don Crosby, who is a Client Accounting Manager with Support Kansas City. He also leads our payroll team. And then Steve Childs, Client Accounting Manager. Steve oversees our 1099 process. So we'll all be contributing here today for this presentation. And then, I, of course, can't list everyone's name up here that's on the SKC team, but if you're an organization that's using SKC for services, your accountant and your payroll processor are an integral part of the team, and they're an amazing resource. So we'll do our best to answer questions here. But if there's anything that you're wondering about or how it specifically pertains to your organization that we can't get to, they are a great resource, and you can always reach out to them with questions, and we'll be able to answer any questions you may have going into the end of the year, any of the nuances or things that might come up between now and January. So just to quickly recap, so today's agenda, first we're going to talk about W-2 processing and deadlines, some of the key deadlines, the procedures. What is the form? If you don't already know what that is, we're probably mostly familiar with it. Some other year-end activities and things that happen that may or may not pertain to the W-2, but that are important maybe going into 2026. Some compliance things that you'll want to be aware of, and some information you'll need and kind of know what to do with. Then we'll share some information about unemployment insurance, state unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. I think there's a lot of information out there that I find a lot of people don't know that actually is important. And just give you some food for thought and some things that you may want to think about with your organization. So we'll sort of touch on those, and then we'll move into the 1099 reporting and talk about, again, some of the key deadlines and kind of what to expect from Support Kansas City if we're processing those for you, and kind of how that process goes if you haven't been through it before. If you have, it's very much the same, but it's good to recap. And then, of course, questions at the end. So first, we'll talk about the W-2. So like I said, in case you don't know, the W-2 is a filing required by the IRS, and the deadline is January 31st, and it's a form where you report wages and taxes and certain other benefits to the IRS, and you're also required to furnish that form to the employees. So of course, I'm not going to go into difference between employees and contractors, but if you're paying someone and withholding payroll taxes, they're probably an employee and they need a W-2. If you're processing your payroll in a software during the year, the good news is I think a lot of the work that goes into making the W-2 correct has already happened. If we're doing your payroll, we're making sure employees are onboarded or offboarded, they're set up correctly, tax elections are put in, all the payments going to the taxing agencies are happening, returns are being filed, and all of that good stuff. So generally that goes pretty smoothly. By the end of the year, everything's in there, and it can be a pretty seamless process. There are some sort of things that come up that we'll talk about in a minute. But generally, if you're using Gusto, for example, which is the software that Support Kansas City primarily uses with the organizations we're processing for, most of this is kind of geared around that, but I know we do have some organizations that use some other software, ADP, Paycor, things like that. They all function very similarly, if not exactly the same, and probably in some cases in terms of sort of the deadlines and what they do. But if you are one of those other softwares, I'd encourage you to reach out to your payroll processor after this, just to maybe clarify that some of these things may or may not apply to you. I'm going to kind of talk about Gusto mostly, but like I said, it's generally the same process. Some of the dates might change a little bit, if anything. So at the end of the year, Gusto will handle most of the work for you. So once December 31st rolls around, we've processed all of our payrolls for the calendar year. Support Kansas City will go in and ensure that the filings are generated properly. Gusto will e-file them. And it will also distribute the copies to your employees for you, which is nice. So there's an option for paper or electronic. So depending on the election that your employee makes in Gusto in the system, will determine how they get their W-2. If they do not opt for electronic only, they will get a mailed copy. We do encourage you to encourage your employees to go in, log into their individual Gusto account and opt for electronic. It's not required, but it just does provide some faster access, and less paper waste is always nice. So if they're able to get in there, that's not a bad idea, and they'll be able to access their copies probably faster as well. And so that's all sort of automatically will happen. If there's any issues or anything that we notice, we would alert you, but otherwise it usually proceeds pretty well. And then just on the topic of employees and updating their profiles in the system, we always encourage employees to go in and do self-service. Again, they can go in and, if your name changed or your address changed this year, now's a good time to go in and make sure that that's updated if it hasn't already been done. Especially if you're getting a paper copy of the W-2, make sure it goes to the right address, the information's correct on the return and all of those things. So it's a good tip to just remind the employees to go in and double check. And that's not necessarily something that you should just do at the end of the year, but certainly, around this time, to make sure the W-2s are correct, it's a good practice. And also just something to think about for 26, as they go in updating tax elections, people's dependents change or things change, and they need to update their W-4s. That can all be done in the system as well by the employee directly. So now's a good time to go in and do that so that when we kind of roll into 2026, all updates or withholdings and things like that are sort of right where they want them to be. So it's a good time to go through that process. So I want to talk about some of the critical deadlines. So December 29th is a big one. And so just a little basic accounting, the IRS operates on a cash basis. So, in terms of reporting money that's been paid in 2025, they care about what actually got paid in the year, not necessarily what was earned or accrued or any of those kind of things. And so in order for any particular compensation, whether it's the regular paycheck, their bonus, anything like that, in order for it to be counted as 2025 wages on the W-2, they need to be paid in 2025. And so the December 29th deadline, again, if you're using Gusto, generally there's a 2-day lead time. So we would need, if you're going to pay an employee this year and you want the compensation to be on their W-2 for 2025, we need to process that payroll in Gusto by the 29th, no later. There are some organizations out there, however, that have more of a lead time for various reasons, and you should probably already know if that's you. So just bear that in mind if you're a special case. But generally it's 2-day. It's similar, same for most other processing softwares, but there could be some variations there. So you'll want to double check that. And there's no rule that says someone has to be paid in a certain year versus another, at least as far as the IRS is concerned. But a lot of times I know employee expectations are a certain way, and they're getting money and they expect it to show up on a certain return and impact them and their tax return. So I think it's just good to know that if it's going to be counted on this 2025 W-2, we have to get those things processed in there in the system by that deadline. And then I put a little asterisks up there just because, of course, if SKC is processing your payroll, we do require a little more lead time. 29th is when we need to click the button in Gusto to actually process. But if you have bonuses, especially if we're helping calculate anything, we'll need at least another business day or two before that to kind of make sure everything's lined up and go through all the proper reviews. So just something to keep in mind with that. And then the second deadline, so January 2nd. So after everything's been paid, there still is some wiggle room, some opportunity to make some adjustments to the return before the system goes ahead and generates it. That could be in cases which we'll talk about in a minute. Maybe you paid bonuses, you had to cut someone a paper check on the fly for some reason, and it hasn't yet got into the payroll system to have taxes debited out and all of that. If you're in that situation, we have a little more time to run those things through the payroll so that it's properly kind of flows through to the return. So keep that in mind. And actually, I'll say Gusto didn't officially publish these deadlines yet. We kind of went by what was done last year. So if anything, there might be a little more time than this, but this is kind of the conservative cutoff for that. So and again, we'll kind of talk about year-end bonuses in a second, but if you're in that situation, let your processor know. I mean, if anyone has been paid, outside of the processing, the software, we definitely want to look at that. If it's taxable compensation versus, say, a reimbursement or something like that, we can kind of help talk through, what is it? How does it need to be treated? But the sooner you let us know, the better. And of course, if we miss that deadline, I mean, corrections can be made, but it's not ideal just because then that's going to delay getting a corrected form generated. That can impact the employee with filing their returns. And there's other things that go into that and just causes a little bit more time and stress potentially. So really, if to the extent that we can kind of get everything captured by then is really makes things go the smoothest. And then number three, fringe benefit reporting, sort of similar. I mean, if you have health insurance benefits, other types of things, generally they're probably having been captured in the system during the year, but if for some reason they were not, still have an opportunity to reflect those. The IRS does require and the W-2 to disclose, health benefits paid for employees and things like that. So there's still a chance to get that in there. And just worth mentioning, I glanced at what the IRS fines are, just something to keep in the way back of your mind. It's anywhere from $60 to $660 per form, depending on or and then if it was intentionally negligent or something like that, that can kind of vary. So just like to put that out there. There are penalties. Generally, things tend to go pretty smoothly, but they will assess fines if things are late. So that's important to know.
And could I add that for those people who have their insurances paid after taxes or post-tax, that those probably are not being captured in Gusto, the employer portion. So they'll have to let us know what those are so we can add those. But those with a pre-tax program will have that captured in Gusto. You can even check on your payroll stubs to see whether you have the employer part of your group health insurance added to the Gusto data.
Yeah, thanks, Don. And yeah, if you're unsure if something is included or isn't, reach out to your processor and they can talk you through and look at that and see how things are being reported and we can make adjustments. Okay. I'm going to talk about the year-end bonuses. This always, if there's any sort of wrench in the works that comes in at the end of the year for W-2s, it usually tends to be this. I know Christmas parties happen, other things happen. I know a lot of organizations, employers, they like to give bonuses, surprise the employees, which is great. But something to keep in mind, whether you're cutting them a check for cash or giving them a gift card, for example, or really anything that is sort of can be considered taxable compensation, we want to run that through the payroll system so that taxes are withheld. The employee's portion is withheld and paid. The employer portion is withheld and paid. And it's very simple to do. I mean, and we definitely don't discourage you from, surprising the employees and giving those kind of things. That's no issue there. Just the more notice you can give us if you are planning to run a bonus or pay a bonus at a meeting or an event or something like that, let your processor know and say, hey, these are the amounts. And then we can handle sort of running that through the system and making sure it's all handled well in advance. And then there's, certain considerations, questions we'll ask, are you grossing up the bonus or, is the employee paying the taxes on their bonus? In which case, we might need to give you a net pay amount versus the gross amount. There's, in terms of how much you actually give them, that's going to impact the taxes. So the more you can kind of communicate up front about what you're thinking with your processor, the better we can help you and just make sure everything is handled properly. And like I said, I mentioned gift cards, that those are essentially, as far as the IRS is concerned, they're considered cash, same as if you just cut them a check. So we can run those amounts through the system as well. Those are typically the ones that we see the most. And filing frequency updates. So this is something that does not pertain to the W-2s, but it's important. At the beginning, either late in 2025, maybe even starting now or in the next month or two, you may start getting letters from Missouri, from Kansas, maybe if you're registered in other states for taxes, potentially from there as well, even potentially from the IRS. But they'll be notifying you if there's a change in your filing frequency for the upcoming year. And so those are very important because when they send you that letter, they expect you to make that take effect immediately starting in the next of the year. So if you're a quarterly Missouri income tax return filer and they switch you to monthly, they're expecting that January return. And if you don't, they'll send you a notice and there can be fees and penalties. And so we always ask you to keep an eye out for that. It's most likely going to come in the mail to you as the employer, whatever address you have on file with the taxing agency for those types of notices. As soon as you get those, forward them to your processor. Or if SKC doesn't do your payroll, you'll want to make sure you input those into the system. And usually that's a pretty easy process. But we just always like to put that out as a reminder. Um, make sure you forward those as soon as you get them, so we can ensure the frequency is all set up correctly for the upcoming year. And so now I'll turn it over to Don, who will talk about PTO and take us on to the next.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's important to know that lots of clients have different rules for how they do their paid time off, their vacation, their sick, all those things. And software, by and large, handles that very well. But as you know, software only does what you tell it to do. So if you think it's going to do something, if that's not specifically written in the rules correctly, then you might be surprised about how that turns out. So when it comes to things like adding a bulk of PTO at the beginning of the year, or even rules about when you roll over PTA. For instance, if you only allow them to carry over 40 hours of paid time off at January 1st, I think it's important to check that and to realize what's happening. For Gusto, for those clients on Gusto, the key date there is not the pay date, but the pay period date. So a pay period, which includes January 1st, will reflect all the rules that are set up for January 1st. So some employees might be expecting to see it on their paycheck for the last day of the year, or for that includes that's paid after the first, but it really will only come into effect on that actual payroll that includes the first. So my recommendation is either to check your own pay stubs to see, make sure that's right, or go ahead and reach out to us, and we can always print out a report of the current status of PTO. It kind of is good to check that right away, because we can always make adjustments. So if it's not what you're expecting, if it's not what you wanted to see, if it doesn't fit with your employee handbook rules, then we can always make those adjustments. Of course, it's easier to make adjustments soon after the first of the year, so we don't have to go a lot of backtracking and a lot of back adjustments. But just reach out to your processor or reach out to me, and we can certainly make any adjustments or corrections to that. And just the key part of that is just to make sure that you look at it after the first of the year and make sure it's doing what you think it's doing. And just kind of, it's a good time to also just refresh yourself on your own employee manual or own employee handbook and just know what those rules are. Dan, we got the next slide. Okay, I wanted to go into some on unemployment insurance, and this is pretty important. First of all, I think one thing to note is that as a 501c3 in both Kansas and Missouri, the employers who are in the unemployment system have an option on how they want to do this. They can either pay that contributory, which means that there is a certain percentage of each employee's wages up to a certain cap that is taken out of that is paid with the payroll as part of the payroll taxes. And so this is in Missouri and Kansas. This is both states have an employer only, so no employee contributions to it. But so if an employer elects to do it contributory, you'll see a deduction on each payroll for the employer amount of taxes that are due for unemployment. The other option they have is to be reimbursement, which would mean that the employer would only pay into the unemployment system if an ex-employee makes a claim. And so you would get a bill at the end of each quarter that says employee so-and-so has applied for unemployment benefits, and this is the amount paid. You need to pay this back into the system. Which is best depends on kind of what the organization is. A lot of our small employers aren't going to have any claims or many claims at all. So you might want to think about going that reimbursement route. For those that are cash short or just live in, if you do it the contributed way, then you have a set expense each pay period that you know about. You can budget that and you can pay that as you go. So those are kind of the two different ways to decide whether you want to be reimbursement or contributory. When it comes to Kansas and Missouri, different rules about unemployment. I think most important thing to remember is that when you have to join the unemployment system. So for 501c employers, that requirement is if you have four or more employees in any single week period, then you are required to have the unemployment insurance. If you have three or less, there's no unemployment insurance required. What that means in Missouri is that you are required, if you do not have coverage and you do not elect to have coverage, then you are required to give a notice to your employees that they're not covered by the system. For those employees who are not covered by the system, if they find themselves unemployed, then there's no benefit for them at all. They're out of luck when it comes to filing those claims. Employers can, if they have three or less employees, out of the goodness of their heart, decide to enroll in the system, and it can be either reimbursement or contributory. And the only requirement is that you would have to stay within the system for 2 years. So once you sign up for it voluntarily, you're in for 2 years. Also, you need to understand that if you add employees, as you get that fourth employee, then you do need to report that. You need to start enrolling for that taxes, and you start paying those unemployment taxes. And so those are the different rules about that. Kansas, there's no requirement to report that they have not covered, but it's probably a good idea. It's probably best practice. So if an employee does lose their job, they'll understand that they won't be getting those benefits. The last section I want to cover under unemployment is just that you need to make sure that you provide accurate information and that you will be getting letters regarding your unemployment rate from each year from the unemployment state office. And you need to let your processor know so we can put that into the system so they can make sure the taxes are paid correctly. The question about whether it's full-time or part-time, it's any employee. So if you have four employees altogether, that you are required to report that. So it's the number of employees, not number of hours, and not number of full-time equivalents. And I asked Dan if I could add a little section here on workers' comp. Workers' comp, as you know, is kind of a state-regulated system that kind of works to the advantage of employees and employers. That employees do not have to sue the employer to get benefits if they're injured on the job, and the employer's payment for that is limited to medical expenses, and lost time does not involve pain and suffering or any punitive damages. And so that's kind of a trade-off the states have worked. Each state is different. For those in Missouri, the requirement in Missouri is that if you have five or more employees, that you are required to have unemployment insurance. And if you do not provide, workers' comp insurance, If you do not provide workers' comp insurance, the minimum fine for that is $50,000. In Kansas, the rules are different. Kansas requires you to have workers' comp insurance if you have more than $20,000 in payroll. And for Kansas, it is payroll anywhere. So if you got a Kansas worker, you need to provide them workers' comp insurance. The minimum fine in Kansas is $25,000 for not having workers' comp insurance. And I do know that they checked that. We have a client recently that got notice from the Kansas that they were looking at fining them for not having workers' comp insurance. It turns out they were under the limit, so they were okay on that, but it's something to be mindful of. And that's what I had to say about workers' comp. I'll turn it over to Steve.
All right, thank you, Don. So up to this point, what Dan and Don have talked about has all been related to employee contribution. The 1099 process basically covers every other payment that you made throughout the year that is non-employee. So it's pretty straightforward process, and your role is critical, but fairly straightforward. As you see here, that first bullet point, collect W-9 forms from all vendors. So the best thing that you can do is before you make that first payment to any vendor that you've hired, is get that W-9, send that on to us, and we'll get that into the system for you, and we'll be good to go from that point forward. I'll kind of touch on the kind of the high level of what the 1099 is and what the processes are, but for your part, that's the critical point. So like I said, the 1099, is the way that the IRS can track payments that, didn't go through kind of W-2 employees. There's two main forms that we'll see, the 1099 NEC, which is for non-employee compensation, and then the 1099 MISC or miscellaneous, which is pretty limited, but we see it mostly with landlords. That's where your rent payments would be reported, a few other scenarios. So at Support Kansas City, we've kind of started kicking off, our processes here, which is reviewing all of the payments that are in the books throughout the year of 2025, and seeing, where we stand with collecting the W-9 forms. Do we have any payments that went out that we don't have that tax information from your vendors? So it's possible that you've seen some communication from Support Kansas City at this point. It's possible that you haven't. We haven't gotten to all of our clients with our preliminary reviews yet. But it's also possible that we've done that preliminary review and you've done, everything that you needed to do, and you got us all the tax forms, and we're good to go. So like I said, we've kind of started that. We do that in the last quarter of the year, so that once we hit January, we'll be in a pretty good spot to finish up what we need to gather. So the 1099s will go to, your vendors, your contract employees. It's anyone who cumulatively throughout the course of the year receives $600 or more from you. So it's not a one-time payment. If you made two payments of $500 each, even though each individual payment is under that $600 threshold, it does accumulate throughout the year. So it's anything that's $600 or more. The good news is starting next year, 2026 tax filing period, that threshold goes up to $2,000. So we should see, a few less forms having to go out. But for 2025, we're still at $600. There are some exceptions. If it's a corporation, that's excluded. So you go to Walmart, that's obviously a corporation. We don't file for that. Payments made with a credit card, a debit card, through PayPal or Venmo, those all get reported by those providers. So we wouldn't be responsible for sending 1099s in those scenarios. The forms themselves, pretty straightforward. It'll have your organization's name, address, tax ID number, and then the recipient of the payment, their name, address, tax information, and then the amount that they were paid throughout the year. So Support Kansas City, in most cases, provides the services for you. There are a few of you that do it on your own. But for the most part, like I said, we would just reach out to you to gather any missing tax forms that we would need. We will, go through QuickBooks or whatever accounting platform that you're on. We'll go through all the transactions. We will accumulate it all. We will put the forms together. And then by the January 31 deadline, which is the deadline that we have to hit, Support Kansas City would send the forms to your vendors, to your contractors, as well as the IRS and the state tax authorities. Let's see, I think that pretty much covered everything that I wanted to talk about, with the exception of, I guess, a couple of points for you to help us out. One, obviously, is getting us those W-9s, but also we have to make sure that all of your transactions for the year are input before we can finalize this process. So once January rolls around, it's critical that, if you do the bookkeeping into QuickBooks, that you're getting those in quickly. If Support Kansas City does it for you, that you get us the information, the backup that we need to get that done, so that we can start our process in early January and have that time needed to meet our 131 deadlines. And then lastly, a little bullet point there on the screen. If you do happen to receive a CP 2100 report letter from the IRS, that would just mean maybe there was a mismatch between a W-9 and the 1099s that were formed, just some kind of discrepancy that the IRS has noted. Send that on to Support Kansas City. We'll take a look and determine, whether any action is needed, and if so, what that action is. All right, I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Okay, I wanted to talk about some just additional things to think about for the year end. For those clients who use Gusto, Gusto is pretty good about letting you know what's going on and what they need. So pay attention to those emails that you get from Gusto. They have alerts for various things that go on, filing requirements. And I wouldn't necessarily count on it, but I do know that for some of the clients who've given Gusto access to Missouri data, that if your rates change or some of your filing frequencies change, Gusto will update that for you. But I wouldn't count on that. To be sure and make sure that you send any notices to your payroll processor so we can get that entered. This year, like years in the past, Support KC will be providing different calendars for each of our clients. This year, we're going to have payroll calendars again, and it will list the cutoff dates. So these are the dates that we need to have your timesheets or your payroll information. Any new employees need to be submitted by those cutoff dates. It's usually going to be 3 days before the payroll, but it depends on weekends and holidays, and those changes as the months roll off. The other thing that we're going to add this year is we're going to be adding the pay period dates to that. So we're going to be putting on there, if you're paid on the 30th, that it's coverage from this date to this date. So that'll be added to that, and so it'll help you plan ahead and help. I mean, something you could even give to your employees so they'll know that when they work from this date to this date, they'll be paid on the certain pay date based on the calendar. The other thing that we wanted to just mention is that we do require employers to submit any changes to personnel on a SKC personnel form. That helps everyone to be on the same track and to use the same form and make sure that we have all the right approvals. So that's why we'll be looking for the SKC form for both personnel changes and for new employees. We've got different forms for each of those changes, and then we'll be looking for those to be properly authorized by whoever at the client's office is in charge of submitting that or has been given authority to submit that. And those are all uploaded through ShareFile. That's our secure way of doing things. I also wanted to mention this time that for those employers that use Gusto, that we are finding that the Gusto self-onboarding system is very efficient. That's a system that we can use that would, if we have the employee's start date, their title, and their home email address, that we can go ahead and send them information from the very beginning of their employment. And that way we don't have to worry about Social Security numbers being transported through unsecure methods or even being transposed, or the same thing with those paycheck direct deposits. If that bank information, account information can go into Gusto directly and not have to be transcribed or retyped, or even it turns out that it very efficiently is hidden and secured even from those who are processing the payroll. So it's a great system. I encourage everyone to use that. If you have not used that before, talk to me or talk to your processor about how we can get that set up. And with that, turn it back to Dan.
Thanks, Don and Steve. So yeah, we're at the end of the presentation. Just to recap some of the important things that we talked about. For W-2 processing, make sure that employees have updated their information within the system so that the forms are filed correctly. Note the deadlines that we talked about for making payments in 25 and the adjustments related to getting the W-2s on time. With the 1099 processing, the key takeaway is get those W-9s from your vendors before you pay them. And certainly, you know, when your SKC accountant reaches out, provide those as soon as you can so that we can get that information into the system and ensure we've got everything lined up to hit that January 31st deadline. And then some other things looking into 2026, you know, unemployment insurance rate letters, filing frequency letters. As soon as you get those, if you get those, be sure to forward those to your processor as well. We can get those updated. And then just keeping in mind some of the information that Don shared with you about unemployment insurance and work comp insurance. You know, SKC, unemployment insurance is a payroll tax. So if SKC is providing payroll services, we certainly can help setting that up. If you don't already have one, don't hesitate to reach out. If you feel like you want to explore that more or just have questions about, you know, whether you think you need it or not, or whether you meet the criteria, we can talk through that at any point. And that is it. So I'll thank you everyone for your time and attention. I'm going to turn it